Thank you for attending another class for the YPS NETIV venture to bring great news to the world, and that is there is a God who wants to interact with every human being, and that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Jewish people are the priests of the nations, and with that partnership of the pious of the nation and the Jews in the nation, we're going to bring about redemption. It's going to be a beautiful thing. We're seeing it happen already. The next couple of classes, we're going to be talking about Shabbat. Very important question. The question of Noahides observing Shabbat comes up quite a bit. Unfortunately, there is much confusion surrounding the issue. Some have encouraged Noahides to keep a form of Shabbat observance, mistakenly equating Noahides with Ger Toshav, as erroneously understood the Ger Toshav relationship to Shabbat. Now, that seems to be an oversimplification. It probably is. There are many reasons why some rabbis have said, well, you can do some modified version of Shabbat. In most cases, the advice is, yes, you can do things of Shabbat, minus many of the other details that are required for the Orthodox Jew. And if you do it with the intent that you are not commanded to do it, then clearly you can do it. But let's see if we can take some of the confusion out of the whole thing. Now, this confusion is understandable, and considering that the question involves advanced mechanics of Torah law and a beguiling array of often contradictory sources. For example, Sanhedrin 58b. Here is the prohibition. Rabbi Rish Lakish, a non-Jew who refrains from labor for an entire day, is liable for death as it is written. Day and night they shall not cease. Genesis 8:22. Another, the master said, their warning is sufficient to warrant their death. This is even for a non-Jew refrains from work on Monday. Now here's the challenge. If this is, then let the prohibition be counted among the Noahide laws. It's not. The answer, the Noahide laws are enumerated as prohibitions. They are not listed according to their positive aspects. Sanhedrin 58b, in that commentary, it says a non-Jew who refrains from labor for an entire day is liable for death, as it is written. Genesis 8:22 says the same thing. Night and day and night shall they not cease. An explanation of this verse, at first glance, seems to refer to the progress of seasons. However, Resh Lakish explains the word they as referring to man. Therefore, this verse is prohibiting Noah and his descendants from disengaging from labor of the world for an entire day. Now, this is a positive commandment that precludes observance of Shabbat. There is ambiguity in thought here as whether this is a general prohibition on cessation of work or a specific prohibition on doing on religious reasons. The master said their warning is sufficient to warrant their death. Now, if we've spoken about death over and over, this is by the hand of not a Jewish court. Now, here's an explanation. This is the general rule of transgression of a Noahide commandment for which a warning is evidenced in the Torah. Certain prohibitions, however, are derived obliquely and are not subject to punishment by death. The Rambam understands the punishment for keeping Shabbat as heavily and not imposed by human court. Said Ravina, this is even for the non-Jew refraining from work on Monday. An explanation, the intent of Ravina's statement is unclear. Rashi, Ridbaz, and Rav Moshe, they understand that Ravina is telling us that Gentiles are prohibited from establishing a particular 24-hour period to abstain from work for any reason. To take a day off occasionally, to rest only with no religious motivation, would be acceptable. However, Yad Ramah, this prohibition, applies only if the rest is religiously motivated. It does not matter, according to them, whether this motivation is monotheistic or pagan, or according to them, to establish a 24-hour period of rest from work for health reasons would be permitted. For example, if you work for a living, taking a day off is permitted. This is not what it's talking about. Here's the challenge. If this is, then let this prohibition be counted among the non-Jews. The Noahide laws are enumerated as prohibitions, and they're not listed according to their positive aspects. Rashi and other Talmudic commentators explain that Noahide laws, meaning the general categories themselves, are listed according to their negative aspects only. Even though the laws may include positive commandments, there are subclasses of general prohibitions. As mentioned in a previous lesson, in Danim, the requirements of establishing courts appears to be positive. Nevertheless, it is primarily negative in that it establishes courts to enforce other negative prohibitions. Yevamos 48b, Shabbat and the Ger Toshav. Sanhedrin 58b is apparently contradicted by a brisa in Yevamos 48b. The Talmud there is discussing the law of an Eved, indentured servant, purchased before Shabbat, and prohibition for his performing work on behalf of his master. The same brisa concludes with a statement. It says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Your ox, your donkey, shall rest, the son of your maidservant, the ger, that they may be refreshed. Exodus 23:12. And the ger, this refers to the ger toshav, alien resident, a resident alien. Now the Talmud tells us that the word ger used in this verse refers to a ger toshav, in this verse telling us that the ger toshav must observe Shabbat. Is that true? How can that be? A ger toshav is not a Jew. And as the Talmud stated in Sanhedrin, non-Jews cannot observe Shabbat. Since the verse uses the generic term ger, it might be that the Torah means ger tzedek, a convert to Judaism. Now, you might question, how do we know this refers to a ger toshav? Perhaps it refers to a ger tzedek. And this cannot be because the other verses state this. And the seventh day is a Sabbath, and you shall do no labor, both you and the ger within your gates. Deuteronomy 5:14. The Talmud understands the verse ger within your gates as referring to a ger tzedek, a full convert to Judaism. Since another verse has already taught us that a ger tzedek must observe Shabbat as a Jew, then our passage must be referring to a ger tzedek, the only other type of ger. Now, what are we to make of this? There are a number of explanations. Rashi understands the Talmud simply by saying the ger toshav must keep Shabbat. Apparently, Rashi derives this position from the Talmud in Eruvin 69b. There it states that one who desecrates Shabbat is like one who worships idolatry. Rashi applies this idea to a ger toshav. Since the ger toshav has disavowed idolatry, he must therefore keep Shabbat. Rashi must interpret the Talmud's prohibition from Sanhedrin 58a as only precluding idolaters from observing the Shabbat. Now, let's look at Tosfos. A ger toshav has no obligation to observe Shabbat and may not do because of the aforementioned passage in Sanhedrin. The Talmud here is only discussing whether or not a non-Jew may do work for a Jew on Shabbat. This certainly seems to be the intent of the verse. Once again, we have these nuances that shine light on a subject but doesn't necessarily clarify it. Quoting again, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Your ox, your donkey shall have rest, the son of your maidservants and the ger, that they may be refreshed. The first part of this verse discusses animals and servants working on behalf of a Jew, and they clearly have no intrinsic obligation to observe the Shabbat. Correspondingly, the first part of the brisa discusses a Jew's servant working on his behalf. And the second part of the brisa is explained that the ger toshav is likely prohibited from working on behalf of a Jew. The basis of Rashi and Tosfos' disagreement appears to be that the other entities mentioned in the verse, such as ox, donkey, servant, etc., are subject to the will of the master, while the ger toshav is not. And a ger toshav is completely autonomous. Tosfos seems to interpret the verse inclusion of ger toshav to mean you may not think that a ger toshav, being a non-Jew who is not in your household, may labor on your behalf. But the verse is teaching that this is not. Tosafot's explanation is certainly consistent with the Talmud's discussion. Rashi's opinion, though, is very difficult to understand. First of all, Eruvin 69b is only describing Jewish desecration of Shabbat. not that of the Ger Toshav. To apply it to the Ger Toshav, we have to have some other pre-existing reason to equate Jewish desecration of Shabbat to that of a Ger Toshav. Moreover, the comparison is made for the unique purpose of explaining when a Shabbat desecrating Jew may be trusted or combined with other Jews for certain matters of halakha. In other words, it is only asking when a Jew is treated as an idolater in certain areas of Torah law. This entire issue is compounded by the lack of clarity as to how Rashi defines Ger Toshav. Because of the difficulties in explaining Rashi, the Maimonides and Shulchan Aruch and other codifiers decided the halakha like Tosafos. Therefore, even a Ger Toshav is included in the prohibition of a Gentile observing Shabbat. Let's look at what Talmud Krisus 9a says. There's a similar discussion in the Talmud in Tractate Krisus 9a. It says, our rabbis taught in a Braisha, a Ger Toshav may do work for himself on Shabbat in the same degree as a Jew on the intermediate days of the festivals. Rabbi Akiva said, as a Jew on the festivals. Rabbi Yossi said, Ger Toshav may labor on Shabbat for himself, just as a Jew may do in the weekday. The Talmud tells us that the halakha is like Rabbi Yossi. Thus far, we have seen that there is nothing preventing a Ger Toshav from performing labor on the Shabbat, since a Ger Toshav is a de facto Noahide. We may infer that there is nothing prohibiting a Noahide from doing labor on the Shabbat. At the same time, there is a positive commandment requiring the inhabitants of the world to constantly engage in the world. This requirement precludes observance of Shabbat. Let's examine Midrash Rabbah. The Midrash explains the idea behind this prohibition. Rabbi Yossi, son of Hanina, said, a Gentile who observes the Shabbat before being circumcised is liable to the death penalty. Why? Well, because he's not commanded to do. But what is your reason for saying that a Gentile who observes the Shabbat is liable for death penalty? Said Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. If a king and a queen are sitting in a conversation, someone comes and barges between them, he is liable to death. 2 is the Shabbat between Israel and the Holy One, blessed be he, as it is written. You shall speak unto the children of Israel, saying, you must keep my Shabbat, for it is a sign between me and the children of Israel. Exodus 31:13. Therefore, a non-Jew who comes and places himself between them and being circumcised is liable to the death penalty. Now, prior to the giving of the Torah, the rest of Shabbat was a privilege of God alone, and man was not allowed to partake in it. The commandment of observing the Shabbat, the divine day of rest, was given to the Jews alone as part of their unique covenant with God. In the next lesson, we will look at further possible relationships between the Noahide and the Shabbat. Let's go through a quick summary of today's class. The Torah prohibits Noahides from observing Shabbat, requiring them to be involved constantly in making of the world, producing, being productive in the world. This prohibition only applies to religiously motivated resting. A Ger Toshav has no obligation to observe the Shabbat. They are likewise enjoined against observing Shabbat. The Talmud in Krisus reiterates the halakha with regard to the Ger Toshav. The Midrash Rabbah explains that the reason for prohibition is because Shabbat is a matter between God and Israel. We'll step into this with more details in the next class on Shabbat. Clearly, we're finding out that because a Noahide or Ger Toshav is not prohibited to do work on the Shabbat, then clearly they can do it. The question is, can a Noahide or a Ger, or let's just say this way, can a Noahide observe Shabbat in some manner or aspect? And we'll get into that into the next class. Until next class, we'll see you in just a moment. Hi, this is Rod Bryant. Welcome you to another class on Shabbat. This is actually labeled Shabbat 2, the Patriarchs and Shabbat. Before we go on, I would like to invite you to join us on Sunday evening at 4 p.m. for a Q&A session for those who are attending this class, and also Noahides from literally all over the world. We now have practically, I think 187, 189 number of people that are registered in this course, that are taking this course from all over the world, from regions that you wouldn't even know that would be interested in Torah, all the way from South Africa to Burundi, to the UK, to Europe, all over the world. And welcome the great established alumni of this course, and we appreciate you joining in. Don't forget, 4 p.m. Central Standard Time is the Q&A session. We'd love to have you there. If you're interested, write us an email to NETIV, N-E-T-I-V, Center, C-E-N-T-E-R, @gmail.com, and we'll put you on the mailing list as soon as possible. In the last lesson, we saw there is a positive mitzvah upon all non-Jews to remain constantly engaged in the world. And later on, hopefully, we'll have a class that explains what this means. This does not mean constantly working 24/7 without rest. There is a paradigm that is about the people of the nations who constantly engage in creating in the world as a very positive mitzvah. And this is stated in Sanhedrin 58b. This mitzvah, by default, prohibits non-Jews from observing any 24-hour rest period for religious reasons. This is according to Maimonides. This law applies equally to all non-Jews, including the Ger Toshav and Noahides. We saw from the Midrash that the Jews were commanded to partake in the divine rest of Shabbat. Their observance of Shabbat was established as a sign of their unique covenant with God. Yet, we're taught that the patriarchs kept all the mitzvahs. This would have, of course, included observing Shabbat. Considering that the patriarchs were Noahides, how do we reconcile their behavior with the halakha? In Talmud, Yoma 28b, the sources teach us that the patriarchs kept the Torah. Our forefather Abraham kept the entire Torah as it is written. Because Abraham obeyed my voice, this is the quote from the text, and observed my safeguards and my commandments and my statutes and my laws, why not say that the verse speaks only to the Sheva Mitzvot, or the 7 laws? His response, it also refers to circumcision. Therefore, the verse must speak of the 7 laws, more than the 7 laws. Rabbi Bar Chai responds and then says, it refers only to the 7 laws and the circumcision? Rav said to him, if that were the case, then why does the verse state my commandments, my laws? This implies that Abraham kept the entire Torah. Rav Ashi said, our forefather Abraham fulfilled even the rabbinic mitzvahs, or the laws stated when it says my laws, my Torahs, implying both the written and the oral Torah. Now, many of you would be scratching your head at this point and say, well, then how did he fulfill all of the Torah to include the oral law before Sinai? That's for a later discussion. Many later commentaries hold that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Chai, that the patriarchs only observed the Noahide laws plus the other mitzvahs specifically commanded to them. According to this understanding of the Talmud, the patriarchs did not observe the Shabbat. There are a significant number of commentaries, however, who agree with Rav Ashi. According to them, the patriarchs observed the entire Torah, the oral Torah, and possible even later rabbinic decrees. This view requires a lot of explanation, and at this point, I don't have the time to get into it, but we'll attempt to take a stab at it later on. The most obvious question is, how did the patriarchs know the Torah before it was given? There are many good answers to this question, the most famous being that they knew through the Holy Spirit, or divine inspiration, which is just a tad bit below prophecy. This question, though, is nowhere nearly as difficult as the one posed by Leviticus 18:18. States, do not marry a woman and her sister. Yet Yaakov married 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, despite the explicit Torah prohibition. How is this possible according to those who say that he observed the entire Torah? There are many examples of patriarchal behavior appearing to contradict the Torah itself. According to the literalist interpretation of Rav and Rav Ashi, and the Torah observance of the patriarchs must somehow be qualified to explain these contradictions. Many of the greatest Torah scholars in history have tackled this question and arrived at a number of different solutions. For example, Ramban in Genesis 26, verse 5, states, the patriarchs only observed the Torah in the boundaries of Israel. This may be tied to their knowledge of the Torah via Ruach HaKodesh. Makes sense. The Maharal of Prague writes that the patriarchs only kept the positive commandments, not the negative commandments. Writes that there are indeed problems explaining how Yaakov and Yitzhak kept the Torah. His solution is simply disagree with the early commentaries, writing that only Abraham kept the Torah. Indeed, the Talmud only states that Abraham kept the Torah before it was given. Almost all other commentaries disagree, holding that Yitzhak and Yaakov also kept mitzvahs as well. The Or HaChaim to Genesis 49, verse 3, states, though they kept the Torah, it had not yet been revealed and was not yet therefore truly binding. Their observance of the Torah could be modified by prophecy. When they delved into the Torah, it was due to prophetic instruction. Also, the Das Zechanim to Genesis 37:35, Nefesh HaChaim 21, since the Torah had not been given, the patriarchs had no actual obligation to observe it. The patriarchs were empowered to make judgment calls for the sake of building a people. This sampling reveals a trend, and most explanations of how the patriarchs kept the Torah render their observance of Shabbat irrelevant to modern Noahides. A further problem is that many commentaries explain that the patriarchs were not 100% Noahides. Once they accept the covenant of circumcision, the patriarchs were considered Jewish to a degree, permitting them to partake in Shabbat. This also precludes their observance from having many relevance to contemporary Noahides. Therefore, to learn anything useful from the patriarchs, we must seriously narrow our question. The exact question should be, how do we explain Shabbat observances of the patriarchs according to those who hold that the patriarchs were 100% Noahides, and those who hold that they kept to the Torah exactly as we understand it, keeping the Torah? Although many have written about this and how the patriarchs kept the Torah, the cross-section of those commentaries discussing our specific question is very small. Number one, let's talk about the labor of the Noahides. What does it mean when they should continue laboring, or if a Noahide decides to the cessation of labor? First, look at the verse prohibiting Noahides' observance of Shabbos. Day and night shall they not cease. When the Torah prohibits Gentiles from observing the Shabbat, it is telling them that they may not refrain from labor for an entire day. What type of labor are we talking about, though? The Benyon Tzion makes a brilliant observation. That is the 39 prohibitions of labor, the 39 melachot for Shabbat. The Torah's concept of labor for the purpose of Shabbat were not articulated until Sinai. Since the details of these labors were not previously known to the world, they could not be defined of a definition of labor used in regarding the Noahides and their prohibition of observing Shabbat. For example, according to the 39 prohibitions of labor, 39 melachot, defined at Sinai, carrying a needle in a public domain is considered a prohibition of labor for a Jew, that is on Shabbat. However, if a Jew carries a sofa up and downstairs in his home in Shabbat, it is not considered labor and is permitted. And if you want to get into understanding the halachot of Shabbat, that's a different subject and could take a lot of time. Therefore, Sinai, however, the definition of labor was entirely colloquial. Therefore, the prohibition observing Shabbat for the Gentiles was only referring from the colloquial definition of labor and not on the Jewish definition of labor. When the patriarchs rested, they observed the Torah Jewish definition of labor, which was not prohibited for them as Noahides. However, they did not refrain from colloquially defining forms of labor. According to this understanding, Gentiles are only enjoined against setting aside a day, refraining their jobs in regards to yard work, home repairs, etc., because of religious reasons. However, observing the Jewish definition of labor for Shabbat is not a problem. It is not a type of labor from which they are prohibited from resting. The definition of the day, let's look at that. The Panim Yafos also makes a remarkable observation. The verse states, day and night they shall not cease. The verse indicates that the Shabbat may not be observed by non-Jews, is one lasting from daybreak to daybreak. After all, the verse states day and night, not night and day. However, the Jewish Shabbat, the one commanded at Sinai, lasts from nightfall to nightfall. The patriarchs kept the Jewish Shabbat, that is from nightfall to nightfall, which was never a prohibition for Gentiles. This opinion would apparently permit Noahides to observe Shabbat in the same way as Jews. However, the Panim Yafos definition of day as daybreak to daybreak is disproven and rejected by numerous later authorities who find it of great variance with the other established areas of halakha. Let's look at the circumstances of the pre-Sinaitic Noahides, that is, the patriarchs, etc., and their children. The Mari explains that the circumstances of the patriarchs are fundamentally different from that of later Jews. He holds that the reason Gentiles are prohibited from observing Shabbat is because a Gentile is not permitted to imitate the Jewish faith. However, before the giving of the Torah, there were no Jews, therefore there was no point of prohibiting Shabbat observances. But, wait a minute. Wasn't the key verse written in Genesis? This is long before the Jews were commanded to keep Shabbat. If there is no point at that time in prohibiting non-Jew Shabbat observances, then why is the verse written in Genesis? The Mari understands that it is written here for future generations. The Mari would therefore prohibit any modern Noahide in observing Shabbat. Now, let's talk about the patriarchs and monotheism. Rabbi Meir Plotzik, in his writing, refers to an interesting and unexpected view. It says the Talmud states Israel is not governed by Mazel. Mazel is a broad term referring to the created agents and mediators, both angelic and physical, of God's providence in the world. It includes the notion of the stars and the constellations, the physical and transcendental forces in the universe. These entities form a vast mechanism channeling God's providence to the world. Before Sinai, all nations of the world were subjected to this mitigated divine providence. At Sinai, however, the Jews were taken out from this system and became subject to God's direct and ultimate oversight. God signaled this new status by commanding the observance of Shabbat, by asking Israel to share in the divine rest for the seventh day. This is the intent of the verse. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, you must keep my Shabbat, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Exodus 31:13. Given the Jews, a portion of Shabbat was a sign that they were no longer subjected to the cycles of time, seasons, and stars, and the lesser providences. The non-Jewish nations are subject to Mazal. Hence, they must observe the cycle of time and days. When a non-Jew observes a religious Shabbat, it is an attempt to lay claim to a unique providence of Israel to cast off the mitigating forces of creation. Now, let me pause here to say, I doubt any one of you considered the fact that if you were to try to observe Shabbat as an Orthodox Jew, you were attempting to mitigate the forces of creation, because how in the world would you even know that existed? The point is, a person that would attempt to observe Shabbat in the most stringent manner in some way is muzzling himself into a relationship that he has not fully been qualified for. This is why the Midrash describes non-Jewish observance of Shabbat as an interposition between a king and a queen. And remember the story, a person comes in, the king and queen are having a meal, and then person sneaks into the banquet dressed up appropriately, but yet interfering into a private affair. This unique relationship, it would be considered rude. However, God commanded Abraham, exit from your stargazing Israel is not governed by Mazal. God was telling Abraham that from that point onward, he would merit God's direct providence and no longer be subject to the influence of Mazal. Therefore, Abraham was permitted to observe Shabbat fully. Chimdas Israel further explained that Abraham merited this providence by disavowing idolatry. This explanation fits well with Rashi's opinion that a Ger Toshav must keep Shabbat, assuming Rashi defines a Ger Toshav as one who only does not worship idols. However, it appears from the Talmud, assuming a change in providence is the underlying factor. This change only applied to Abraham and his descendants, but to none other. Binyan Zion states non-Jews are prohibited from refraining from colloquially defined types of labor. They may choose to refrain from the 39 melachot. The prohibition is only on observing a Shabbat for daybreak to daybreak. However, the definition of day as daybreak to daybreak is difficult. This interpretation is rebutted by many of the later authorities. The Patriarchs were Noahides and did keep Shabbat. However, the prohibition against Shabbat observance didn't apply at the time. The Chamdas Israel states because they were not idolaters, the Patriarchs merited God's direct providence. Shabbat is the sign of such a providence. This interpretation is precluded by Tosafos, though through and from 28a. Rav Safra said the time of the afternoon prayer of Avraham, which is Mincha, is when the walls begin to grow dark. Rabbi Yosef said we learn halacha from Avram, according, and of course, this is a surprise objection, comes from Rabbeinu Tam, says, and many others explain that the halakha practices cannot be learned based on the conduct of the patriarchs before the Torah was given. God's explanation for the world and the way in which we relate to God fundamentally changed at Sinai. Therefore, the Chamdas Israel's conclusion is not practical. From the above opinions, only the Binyan Zion's regarding the nature of the labor of Noahides reminds the patriarchs to keep the Jewish Shabbat, yet engage in colloquial definition of labor. The conclusion remains, because it is a valid halakha interpretation of all its own and is not dependent on the behavior, status, or actions of the patriarchs. However, observing the Jewish sabbatical restrictions may present a problem in Kedushi Dat, which will be examined in the next lesson. The summary is, the Talmud tells us the patriarchs kept the Torah before it was given at Sinai. This cannot be taken 100% literally because there are examples of patriarchs not following the Torah laws. To learn from the patriarchs' observance of the Shabbat to modern Noahides, we have to look at the commentaries that both view the patriarchs as 100% Noahides and that hold their Torah observance as identical to ours. There are very, very few views satisfying these conditions. Of those meeting our conditions, most of them do not apply to modern Noahides. There is a general rule that we cannot learn our practice from the behavior of the patriarchs. Binyan Zion's interpretation, however, has relevance for modern Noahides. To narrow it all down, the patriarchs and the observance of Shabbat. One would ask, well, Rod, what is the position then for a non-Jew and Shabbat? Clearly, as time begins to progress and more of our postmodern rabbis begin to understand the text, we're getting a better and more clear picture. And that is, for example, Rav Schwartz encourages every person in the world to, at some level, memorialize or remember Shabbat. It doesn't mean that they are to take upon the prohibitions of Shabbat as an Orthodox Jew would be taking on Shabbat, but rather as a memorial and observance, a time of rest, a time of spending with family, of study. Those things are very appropriate. And the same thing that Abraham Avinu or the other patriarchs would have done for Shabbat. Clearly, we've learned a lesson on what the patriarchs did and how it still provides us with a lot of questions. Stay tuned for the next class. We'll be right back in just a moment. Welcome to the third installment on the subject of Shabbat, a practical conclusion. I'm Rod Bryant with the YPS Great Project to bring the knowledge of the Noahide mitzvahs and practical lifestyle course to the nations. And we are excited to say that there are over 180 some odd people enrolled now, and probably by the time this sits here, this has been going on for about 5 weeks now. I can imagine thousands will be enrolled in the next couple of years from all over the world. Welcome to the great classroom of the internet, welcoming all Noahides from all over the world. The last class, we dealt with the Shabbat and the Patriarchs, and to try to answer that question, if the Patriarchs were Noahide, then how did they observe the Shabbat? And what did that actually mean, and how does it translate down to us? As we find out, as we study these sections of the Talmud, etc., and the opinions of the sages, we probably garner more questions than answers at times, but the practical application is what we want to come to on the conclusion of Shabbat. Let's take this and look at a summary of what the sources have taught us so far. Sanhedrin 58b cites Genesis 8:22, which prohibits all mankind from keeping Shabbat. The verse prohibits cessation from work for a 24-hour period. Now, prior to Sinai, the respite of Shabbat was for God alone, and at Sinai, the Jews were commanded to partake in the experience of Shabbat at a sign of their unique status. Rashi, Radbaz, and Rav Moshe Feinstein, commenting on the Rambam, states, for the sake of this prohibition, it does not make difference as to why one rests for the entire day. Even if one sets aside an entire day only to recuperate from work, he still transgresses. Radbaz clarifies this, saying, though this is only if one establishes a regular fixed day, to take an occasional day off is permitted. Midrash Rabbah explains that the prohibition of non-Jewish observance of Shabbat takes a special poignancy after the giving of the Torah. The Jews were commanded at Sinai to partake of the divine rest of Shabbat as a sign of their covenant. Anyone else who tries to do is interposing between God and Israel. The Patriarchs, on the other hand, we are taught that they kept the Torah. However, both the nature of their observance and identity as Noahides are not clear to us enough for us to really draw a practical conclusion. Additionally, there is a principle that we do not learn from halakha that is practiced from the actions of the Patriarchs. Binyan Zion, when the verse in Genesis prohibits the observance of Shabbat by prohibiting the cessation of labor, it is not using the Torah definition of labor. Instead, it is using the colloquial definition of labor. From here, it would appear that a non-Jew may keep Shabbat by observing the Jewish definition of the sabbatical labor. Yet many abstain from the colloquial definition of labor. This interpretation does not seem to be relied upon by many of the above-cited authorities who imply that even the Jewish definition of labor is prohibited for non-Jews. The Binyan Zion also contradicts the Midrash understanding of the Jewish Shabbat as a unique sign between God and Israel. Maimonides states in Hilchot Melachim 10:9, a non-Jew who delves into Torah is obligated to die. They only should be involved in the study of their 7 commandments. Similarly, a non-Jew who rests even on the weekday, observing that day similarly to a Shabbat, is obligated to die. Needless to say, this is also the case if he creates a festival for himself. Now, in the Torah, the Hebrew word for Shabbat may refer to the 7th day, actually, or any day upon which labor is prohibited by the Torah. This would include festivals. The Radbaz quotes Rashi, who writes that any kind of rest for any reason should be prohibited. However, the Radbaz adds, this is if he establishes a day of rest. However, occasional cessation from labor is not prohibited. Now, the general rule governing these matters is this: they may not obligate a new religion or create or perform a mitzvah for themselves based on their own reasoning. Either convert and accept all the mitzvahs or uphold their commandments without adding or detracting from them. That is the bottom line issue for those who come out of the nations. Maimonides explains that the reason for the prohibition of Shabbat observances by non-Jews is found in Kedushi Dat, originating a new religion, discussing a length and a prior lesson. Kedushi Dat would preclude Noahides from observing Shabbat by refraining from the Jewish definition of labor, the 39 melachot. If a Gentile delves into Torah and Shabbat or innovates a religious practice, he is beaten, punished, and informed he is to be obligated to die for his actions. Now remember, in previous classes, there's a caveat to this. Number one, it had to be in the land during the time of the Sanhedrin and the temple. Second, it had to involve those people that were living alongside the Jewish people. It does not have anything to do with people outside of the land, nor in present day. However, continuing on, he is not exactly executed. Harav Hagaon, Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein explains that the Shidat is a general prohibition against Noahides adopting Jewish practices as religious observance. However, the prohibition of observing Shabbat and the structures of Torah study are singled out by Maimonides due to their severity. In conclusion, according to the Binyan Tzion, Noahides may not establish any 24-hour period as a time of rest for work. By work, we mean whatever is colloquially defined as work. According to Maimonides, Noahides may also not observe Shabbat by refraining from the Jewish definition of the work, or the 39 melachot. This would be Kedushidat. Kedushidat would also prohibit Noahides from making Shabbat in any way by using Jewish rituals such as lighting candles, making kiddush, making a blessing for bread, etc., loaves, etc. The conclusion of the Pashkim is, therefore, that Noahides may not observe Shabbat in any way by refraining from work for a 24-hour period or by adopting Jewish rituals. Noahides may not either establish a regular 24-hour period of rest, even for non-Jewish reasons. This is also the conclusion of Rav Moshe Weiner of the Divine Code. Now, with that being said, it must be understood that there is nothing prohibiting a Noahide from marking an occasion with a remembrance or memorial, because this is what the Jewish people do. There is a big difference, and we'll define it in a moment. Let's talk about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Now, a Noahide has two options now as how to deal with the question of labor on Shabbat, etc. We may either take a liberal approach, which follows only the strict letter of the law, or may take a pious conservative approach, acknowledging both the spirit and the letter of the law. The letter of the law is that the Noahide may not commemorate Shabbat by regularly refraining from work on an entire day. It does matter if one rests from daybreak to daybreak or from nightfall to nightfall. He should not refrain from a colloquial definition of work. However, a Noahide may refrain from labor using the Jewish definition of work. That is, provided that he has not observed all the Jewish prohibitions of labor. He should turn on a light or make a fire, do something that would be to do what is prohibited by Jews. Otherwise, he would be transgressing the prohibition of observing the Shabbat, which means a person who is a non-Jew, a Noahide, who have rejected Shituv, rejected idolatry, who believes in one true God, is a monotheist. He too can remember the Shabbat, not observe it in the sense of an Orthodox Jew. I think sometimes for the Noahide, you would tend to use the word, I observe the Shabbat. But when an Orthodox Jew hears, I observe the Shabbat, they are hearing, I observe the Shabbat as an Orthodox Jew. And that's not true. And I don't personally know of any, or if there are many pious non-Jews that, quote unquote, observe the Shabbat When they say observe, and this is for the education of the Jews that will watch this teaching, for those who are not Jews and would say, I observe the Shabbat, they are literally talking about, I honor, revere, I set aside, remember this day as a special day for the Jewish people, that God has made a covenant with the Jewish people, and we, in recognition as the Noahides, believe that God has appointed them to do this. There's nothing wrong with this. We should keep in mind that this observance of Shabbat, however, is meaningless. Observance of Shabbat means resting from the 39 labors defined at Sinai. The purpose in a Noahide doing one of the prohibited labors is that it does not run afoul in prohibition of observing the Shabbat, that his one prohibited labor invalidates the entire observance. Therefore, despite resting for the whole day, he never actually kept Shabbat anyway. The idea is this. Let me try to set this straight. A non-Jew who is a pious non-Jew, who observes the Shabbatzvot, who honors the Shabbat by declaring this day as the seventh day of rest that God has given his people, that use that time to spend with family, to study, to have family meals, whatever it may be, there's no problem at all for you. There's no issue. The issue is when you attempt to do the whole Shabbat as a Orthodox Jew would observe it. It's not appropriate, but second of all, it's not even observing the Shabbat. If you're not Jewish, there's no way for you to observe the Shabbat fully. It's just going to be the fly in the ointment. The idea is, if you're not observing the Shabbat, what are you doing? And that is understand the difference between acknowledging and observing. As we mentioned earlier, God only asked Israel to share in the Shabbat. A Noahide is some way imposing his will upon God. As we saw in earlier lessons, this is a severe issue. Although this mode of behavior is in step with the letter of the law, it fails to acknowledge the spirit of law. It is a liberal approach to Torah, law, and Noahidism. One who seeks to go beyond the letter of the law is a matter of piety, will refrain from any observance of Shabbat. A pious, God-fearer, religious Noahide will not attempt to observe the Shabbat in any way by resting. A Noahide who imitates Jewish observance on Shabbat is less observant Noahide than one who does not observe Shabbat at all. Now the question is what will you do? Let's talk about observance versus acknowledgement. Until now, we have only discussed the observance of Shabbat. By observance, however, we mean refraining from the labor or imitating other Jewish Shabbat obligations. However, this prohibition does not preclude Noahides from having a positive, meaningful connection with Shabbat. In short, Noahides may not observe the Shabbat as an Orthodox Jew, but may certainly acknowledge and commemorate Shabbat. In fact, Noahides may even be required to acknowledge Shabbat. And there are plenty of Patriarchs who say that as well. The Midrash says that a man by the name of Tarnus Rufus approached Rabbi Akiva, and he said, asked Rabbi Akiva, from where can you prove to me that God wished to honor the seventh day? Rabbi Akiva responded, verify it with necromancy, or verify it, because a spirit will ascend on any day of the week except for Shabbat. Verify it with the spirit of your father. Turnus Rufus checked the veracity of Rabbi Akiva's claim with the spirit of his own father. His father's spirit ascended upon every day of the week except Shabbat. Turnus Rufus again raised his father and asked him, Father, is it possible that you became a Jew after you died, that you observed the Shabbat? Why did you ascend every day of the week but not ascend on Shabbat? He, that is Turnus Rufus' father, answered him saying, anyone who does not willfully observe the Shabbat among the living is forced to do among the dead. The Maharzu explains that the spirit of Turnus Rufus' father could not mean that non-Jews must observe Shabbat. Rather, it means that any non-Jew who denies the significance of Shabbat will be forced to do among the dead. What does it mean, forced to do among the dead? The Midrash goes on and explains that the wicked are punished by the fires of Gehinnom every day of the week, but are given respite on Shabbat. One who denies the existence and significance of Shabbat, even a non-Jew, will apparently be held accountable. Furthermore, Noahide's acknowledgement of Shabbat goes back to the beginning of creation. Fascinating Midrash about Adam and Chaim and the composition of Psalm 92. Adam met Chaim and asked him, "What happened? What was your judgment?" Chaim replied, "I repented," and it was mitigated. Adam began slapping his own face and cried out, "Such is the power of repentance, and I didn't know it?" Adam immediately arose and declared, Mizmor Shir Layom HaShabbat, a psalm of song for Shabbat. In Psalm 92, recited by Adam for Shabbat, only mentions Shabbat in its opening. It then goes on to praise God's deeds in creation, curiously contrasting the permanence of his deeds with the temporary follies of the wicked, and then concludes with the praises of the righteous man. What is the connection between the idea of tshuva, repentance, temporary prospering of the wicked, and the Shabbat? Well, speaking with Cain, Adam realized the power of repentance and marveled at its greatness. Tshuva is a great creation for which Adam praises God. God is also praised for his incredible kindness. He does not execute judgment immediately. Rather, he waits, allowing transgressors time to either do tshuva or lose themselves further. Alternatively, Adam also realized that this world is a place of the finite recompense. Here, a person is rewarded for the minority of his deeds. Therefore, the wicked are often rewarded for their few mitzvot, while the righteous are often punished for their few sins. But what does this all have to do with Shabbat? When God rested on the Shabbat, he beheld the goodness of his creation. He saw that it was well suited for his purpose. Too, Adam, in his revelation, suddenly understood the greatness of God and his world and the incredible potential that was offered. In that revelation, he saw the big plan. He understood the nature of reward and punishment, the fate of the wicked, and the ultimate reward of the righteous. He understood his purpose and how the world was designed for it. Rashi understands this psalm as primarily an acknowledgement of the world to come, the ultimate Shabbat. We see that Adam's relationship to Shabbat was not of rest. It was a relationship of epiphany, a day of awakening and realization. This is the Noahide relationship to Shabbat. It is therefore appropriate to base the Noahide acknowledgement of Shabbat on Psalm 92 and Adam's epiphany. In this way, Noahides are following the way of Adam, to whom the Noahide laws are commanded. Now, we can talk about Shabbat prayer and service in the home, and I'm going to tell you there is not a definitive answer on this. However, we will skim through a couple of generalities so that you can know where to go. There is still not a defined liturgy for the B'nai Noach for the service, but as we know before, we are challenged with the ideas that says that the B'nai Noach should not, what you call, adapt Torah practices for Shabbat for the non-Jew. Can they light candles? Well, yes, they can light candles, but are they restricted by the hours or the time of lighting the candles? Some would say no. Others would say if you're going to light candles, make sure that you light it within the time frame that it's supposed to be lit. Others would say, well, you don't light 2 candles because that is only prescribed by the Jewish woman, that you can light multiple candles or you can light 1 candle. There are others who say that only the woman is to give the Shabbat bracha. And for Noahides, it can be the man or the woman, at least one person in the household. The question is what kind of blessing? Some say that you should not do the blessing over the wine or the bread, that you should do some other blessing. This all can be a bit confusing and unsettling because you don't know where to exactly land. However, in the spirit of following after or acknowledging Shabbat, recognizing that it is a day of repentance, renewal, and epiphany, a revelation before God, then this time should be entered in with that same type of prayer. Even if it's a personal prayer or you decide to recite a prayer from the Jewish prayer book, whatever you feel like doing, you do. I would best consult your rabbi, though, or a consulting rabbi nearby to find out exactly the wording that you should use. There are psalms that you can read and pray after lighting a candle, maybe even the psalm that we just talked about. Nevertheless, with that being said, as you mature and as the material becomes available, there will be proper liturgy and prayer books that will be established, God willing, and hopefully a prayer book that both the Noahide and Jew could read from equally. But once again, remembering, it's a very careful line for a B'nai Noach to walk. And in no way do we want to discourage you from observing or acknowledging Shabbat. If anything, we want to fan the flames for the Ben or Bat Noach, for the people of the nations who have accepted upon themselves the love of one God in the Torah and have truly repented from their idolatrous ways, to join the Jewish people and join them in the way that Noahides can join. And that is acknowledge this great day that God has given the Jewish people and the day of rest that God has given the Jewish people. Acknowledge it through tshuva. Acknowledge it through study and for prayer. Acknowledge it through spending time with your family. And know that your life will be richer because you have acknowledged this great day of Shabbat. That concludes this class, and we'll see you next class.